Hi, Phil Borders from Hendricks Therapy, and today we're going to discuss memory. From our previous discussions, you know that memory is part of the cognitive domain. There's 4 areas. There's processing speed, there's attention, there's memory, and then there's executive functioning. So today we're going to focus on memory. So we're going to do a little test. I'm going to give you 9 items. And at the end of this, I'm going to ask you what they were and see how many of the 9 you can remember. The first 3 are E, P, D. E, P, D. Next is big, huge, and large. Big, huge, large. The final 3 are Blue, George, and Michigan Street. Blue, George, Michigan Street. So try to get all those 9 in your head, and again, we'll see in a few minutes how well you did. So what is memory? Memory is when we take information through our environment, through our senses, through our thoughts, and we encode that information to our brain. And then we take that information that's encoded and we store it, and then later we retrieve that information. Now we do this in a variety of ways, and you can kind of subdivide it numerous ways, but 2 fairly easy ways of subdividing it is conscious memory and unconscious memory, and then memory based on time. Now conscious memory are things that we actively try to remember, such as what's called semantic memory, and that's a specific memory like somebody's name, a telephone number, 317-718-8436. That is specific memory. Episodic memory is memory that answers the questions where, when, what. Such as, hey, I'm going to the Pacers game at Bankers Life Fieldhouse Wednesday night at 7. Would you like to join me? That would be episodic memory. Now that's memory that's conscious, so that's memory that we actively try to remember. Then there's unconscious memory. That's memory that we don't really try to remember, but it just kind of happens. And first there's what's called sensory memory. That's memory that we basically get through our senses through hearing, tasting, smelling, seeing, hearing, touching. And that memory lasts a little bit less than a second. So sensory memory is a short-term memory, but it's less than a second. And the reason why that's so brief is that we are inundated with just a bazillion pieces of memory or pieces of information each day, and our brains would explode if we tried to take it all in. So it's just kind of a brief thing that we remember. Again, less than a second. Now, more specifically, short-term memory is less than 30 seconds. Now, a lot of people think short-term memory is longer, but it's 30 seconds or less, which is surprisingly short, but it's enough memory where it helps us carry on conversations, it helps us read, where we're able to remember the beginning of the sentence so we can let it flow into the end of the sentence. So short-term memory is pretty brief also. Long-term memory then is basically anything that's remembered more than 30 seconds. So if all the 9 items that you remember, that's by definition now in long-term memory. So long-term memory is where we encode information, we store that information, and then we're able to retrieve it. Now there's ways of better encoding, storing, retrieving information, and one way is by called chunking information. And that's where you take specific pieces of information and you put them into groups, such as, again, a telephone number, 317-718-8436. That's our phone numbers are spoken that way because that helps us chunk them into groups. Also, one way to help us move something from short-term to long-term memory is just simple repetition. 317-718-8436, 317-718-8436. and we get it stuck into our brain. Now we do that mostly through auditory as well as visual. So the telephone number is more auditory because you can say it. It's a little bit harder to picture for most of us. If we try to remember, say, what a house looks like, that would be more a visual process to go from short-term to long-term memory. So you can, picture a house, you can picture the shutters, picture the front door, picture if it has bricks, the door shape, etc. And the best way to go from short-term to long-term memory is to use actually both processes. If you can visualize and verbalize at the same time, that helps us store, encode, and retrieve information more efficiently and effectively. So let's look at those 9 items. First 3, E, P, D. Now, those items are good, and there's easy ways to remember those, and there's some things that makes it more difficult. They are a little bit easier because they're letters, so you can group them, you can chunk them because they're letters. They sound alike. However, sometimes because they sound alike can make it a little bit harder to differentiate them at the same time. Maybe a little bit difficult to visualize. That's probably more when we're using the auditory. Also, it was the first 3 that we said, so there was a lot of what's called clutter, which is information that happens between when you encode and store the information, then you try to retrieve it. So more time lapse. So of the 9, those 3 experienced the most clutter. The next 3 were big, huge, and large. Now we could clutter those 3 because they're synonyms. That makes it, a little bit easier to remember those 3. You can visualize bigness. Harder again to differentiate. It would probably been easier if the words were big, medium, and small. Those would be easier to differentiate and probably easier to remember. The last 3, Blue, George, and Michigan Street. Now those might be kind of harder to chunk because they're fairly dissimilar, so it'd be harder to go from a specific item into a group. However, you can kind of visualize a Blue George walking down Michigan Street. So if you can visualize that Blue George walking down Michigan Street, then it's a little bit easier. So if you remembered any of those items, then you had stored those into long-term memory. And next discussion, we're going to talk about how our memory is just not as good as we think it is. Hope this was interesting, and I'll talk to you later.